Hey guys, today we are reviewing the next book that I have read in February, and that is Helen Kellers' Teacher. So, if you have not seen my reviews before, or at least my recent ones, can't talk today for some reason, my recent ones, then you may not know that I have a format to my reviews, spoiler and spoiler free. I start off the review by giving 3 pros and 3 cons to the book that are spoiler free. Then I start going into the spoilers by discussing the plot in as much detail as I can, and then I discuss my thoughts and feelings on it in greater spoiler detail. So the spoiler free section, 3 cons and 3 pros. Should be the other way around. 3 pros and 3 cons of this book, Helen Kellers' Teacher by Margaret Davidson. Let's start with the cons so that we can end on the pros. Every time I put this book down, I did not feel enticed to pick it back up. And I think that's because of the fact that I've read so much fantasy this month that the idea of going back to a biography just really wasn't something that I felt like I wanted to do. Yeah. So I read, I think, about 2 or 3 books alongside this one because I just wasn't enticed to pick the book back up. Con number 2. Despite the fact that it is a biography, it is a middle grade biography, and because of that, there is a limit to the amount of pages that are in this book. I believe there's 160, 170, I'll just double check. 153, so even less than I had said. 153 pages in this book, and because of that, there are some sacrifices that do need to be made. And some examples that I can give you that are spoiler free, or well, as much of an overview that doesn't go into too much detail anyway, is that there are moments in the story with Anne Sullivan, who is the teacher, and we see her at 7 years of age, and we might get 1 or even 2 chapters about her being 7, and then we go into the next chapter, and within 2 sentences, she has aged like 7 or 8 years, and we don't know what really happened there, because it basically will say, Helen then, sorry, not Helen, I just said her name, Annie Sullivan. Annie then turned 12 and where moments ago we were reading a chapter or 2 of her being 6, for example. So it does rush through certain sections. Now, that's not to say that anything interesting happened during those years, because I don't know. This is the only book that I've read about Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller, so I don't really know if anything interesting took place during those times, but it was skipped over just so quickly, and it would have been better if there were at least a couple of sentences, like, you know, she was 6, and then the years went by, and the next thing we knew the next thing we knew, Annie Sullivan was 12 years old. However, on her 10th birthday, she received this gift, like at least something, you know. So that was a little bit disappointing for me. The next thing that was a little bit of a con for me, but this is absolutely, subjective, it's my own personal view, is that it took a very long time to get to Helen Keller in this book. I'm going to talk in a moment about the fact that there is actually a movie based off this book and really the life of Annie Sullivan and working with Helen Keller. But in this book, it took to halfway or just over halfway until we got to Helen Keller. What intrigued me about this book when I first saw the cover was, oh my god, it's a book about Helen Keller. I knew little bits about her, and so I thought this would be an interesting read, but I didn't know it was going to take as long as it did to get to Helen Keller. So if you are someone who is able to get through the slog, in other words, the laying the foundation and all that kind of stuff, then you will be fine. But if you are someone who looks at this book and says, oh, this is a book about Helen Keller, it's not a book about Helen Keller, it's a book about Annie Sullivan, but she doesn't get to Helen Keller until at least halfway through the book, if not a little bit further than halfway. But now let's talk about the pros. This book is an extremely emotional book because it deals with so many tough things. Her life growing up, Annie Sullivan's life was oh my gosh, it was a really tough life for her to get through. And then we meet Helen Keller through Annie Sullivan, who is teaching her, and that is very emotional as well. The beginning of that journey is extremely tough. Then we get to the middle and things are getting really interesting. And then we get towards the end and it's really emotional again. It was an emotional journey reading this. So that is pro number 1. Pro number 2, I said in my cons that whenever I put this book down, I found it really hard to pick it back up again because I just wasn't as interested in this book as the other books that I was reading. However, and it's a very big however, once I did pick up this book, I was reeled into this book so quickly and so easily because it is a great read. And I need to make that point in both my con and my pro, is that yes, when I put it down, I wasn't necessarily motivated to pick it back up. But once I did pick it back up, I fell in love with it all over again and was really happy to keep on reading. So that's kind of where I stand with that. The third pro of this book is that of Annie Sullivan's time. Again, I'm keeping in mind not to have any spoilers here. Annie Sullivan's time with Helen Keller was amazing. It was such a wonderful journey from the moment they met each other, how they got to where they got to in the midpoint of their journey and through to the end as well, was just so satisfying. And I know I said 3 cons and 3 pros, but I'm going to give you a 4th pro. The ending was not only so extremely satisfying, but oh my gosh, I started crying because the last sentence... what is with these authors these days and their last sentence just being so amazing? Not every single book, I will say that. There are some authors who will give you just a really easy ending, and then there are some authors who just give you a terrible ending flat out. But there are some authors who will, when they're writing a book, they will have as much importance with the first line as they do with the last line of the book. And oh my god, the last line of this book really tugged at my heartstrings. So it was absolutely amazing. That is my 3 cons and, well, now 4 pros. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to talk about the plot, which is I'm going to categorize that as a spoiler because I am actually talking about what goes on in this book. So if you haven't read this book and you don't want to be spoiled, now is the time for you to click away from this and maybe go look at one of my other reading vlogs or another one of my reviews. But if you are happy to listen to my spoiler side of this review of Helen Keller's Teacher, then do keep going with me. I'm going to quickly pause, and then when I come back, we'll go right into that spoiler version of the review of Helen Keller's Teacher. Okay, so what can I say? This book is a biography, but what really surprised me was that it's a scholastic book. So I don't think you can see it on the bottom there, but that red thing, it says scholastic, and scholastic books are middle grade. They're not YA, they're not young adult, they're middle grade. And so I was really surprised when my friend told me that this is a biography, and I thought, okay, maybe she just thinks it is, I don't know, but it's scholastic, so it has to be a story, right? No, it is a biography, but it is written in a storytelling way, and I do love that. That probably should have been another one of my pros. I do absolutely love that because the biographies that I've read and the autobiographies that I've read, and I haven't read any of them for ages, but the ones that I read and even the ones that I loved, they're very dry, where this was told in a storytelling way, so it was really sweet and I did love it. So basically the book centers around Annie Sullivan, who ends up becoming Helen Keller's teacher, but as I did say in my pros and cons, we don't get to that point until at least halfway through the book. We start with Helen Keller's life. No, we don't. We start with Annie Sullivan's life. I keep doing that. We start with Annie Sullivan's life as a child, and it's a tough life. Her parents, I believe, they died, and so she was dropped off to live with her cousins and her auntie and uncle, but Annie Sullivan... I'm going to say it again. Annie Sullivan was a very wild child, and none of the family, the cousins and her auntie and uncle, none of them really loved her. I mean, it was pretty obvious they didn't. So when Annie was sent away somewhere else and she was going to go meet up with her brother, who we don't really make a lot of the connections of certain things until later on in the book, but what we come to realize is that her brother was somewhere else, because he has problems with his legs, so he had to be somewhere where he could receive constant medical care. So a carriage comes to pick her up, and her brother is in the carriage, and they get to reunite and go off to this wonderful place that is away from her auntie and uncle and her 3 cousins, none of which love her. But where they end up going is this place that I could be pronouncing this incorrectly, but I pronounce as Tewkesbury. Tewkesbury basically is a sanitarium. So, you know, sanitarium, psych ward, elderly people, home. It's referred to as the poorhouse, but it's a mix of this, that, and the other, really. That it is extremely poor. The government don't give them a lot of funding, and so there are reports, and Annie, keep doing that. Annie, even herself, sees mice on the ground, and like there are scratches in the walls, and it's not a nice place because the government just doesn't give them enough funding. Annie makes friends with some of the elderly women, and one of them recommends to her that at the next inspection, because there are many inspections that take place, but generally, even though the place is in such terrible condition, they tend to just ignore it and just say, oh, you're doing a fabulous job, and then leave. One of the old ladies that Annie becomes friends with suggests to her that when the inspector comes by, tell the inspector that you want to get out of there and that you want to go to a school for the blind. Oh yeah, because Annie becomes blind. Because I'm trying to remember everything from the beginning. Annie becomes blind at a certain point when she's young, and they try to do all these things for her, but it's just not really working. So somehow she hears the inspector and goes up and says, I don't want to be here. I want to go to a school for the blind. Eventually, she does get enrolled in a school for the blind, and the other kids pick on her because she's significantly older than they are. Because Annie Sullivan, to this point, has never gone to school. Her cousins and her auntie and uncle are all of the belief that she is such a quote-unquote wild child that she would never survive school. She will never be able to learn to read or write. Anyway, so she ends up in this blind school. No one really likes her. Even the teachers don't really seem to side with her. But she still ends up doing really, really well at the blind school. Then there comes a point where the kids have to go home for the holidays because it's a boarding school, but Annie does not want to go back to Tewkesbury. Her brother, I forgot to mention this, sorry, her brother has died, so that's another tough thing she's gone through. Annie does not want to go back to Tewkesbury, and so she talks to, I believe it's the principal, but I could be wrong there, and he ends up finding her a job to do something, I don't remember what it was, and to keep her kind of entertained. There are operations done for her eyes, and eventually she's able to see certain things because of the lighting. It's not clear, it's fuzzy, but it's much better than it was, and that's a celebration for her, and gosh darn it was a celebration for me. Reading it, I was like, oh my god, she can see certain things, that's amazing. So, very emotional ride. Excuse me. Eventually, Helen Keller, and I do mean to say it this time, her parents have written a letter somewhere asking for someone to come and look after their daughter Helen, who is now deaf, blind, and mute. She's also referred to as dumb quite a bit in the book, and I don't really like that word, so I'm not going to be using it here, and I don't think that Helen Keller is dumb, or at least the stereotype of what dumb is. I just don't like the word in general, but it is used in the book. I'm not going to use it anymore though. So she is deaf, blind, and mute, and someone needs to go and help her. So the blind school recommends that, that Annie, doing it again, that Annie go over and assist her because Annie has had the struggles of being blind, and she can teach Helen how to read Braille and all this kind of stuff. And this is where the story really takes off for me, because up to this point I saw how it was a biography, but once we get to Helen Keller and Annie, it was a story, and it was absolutely amazing. So Annie tries to get to know Helen, but Helen doesn't really want to get to know Annie because Annie's a stranger to her, and Helen is a child, she's a little kid, where Annie is much older, she's an adult. So that's understandable. Then the next morning after the morning that Annie arrives, they're having breakfast. Annie, Helen's parents, and I believe Helen's brother. And Helen is doing some things that Annie doesn't necessarily approve of. For example, she's feeling her way around because she is blind, so she's feeling her way around the table to her brother and her parents' plates and grabbing with her hand food off their plate and shoving it into her mouth. And Annie does not approve of this. And she keeps saying, well, why do you let her do this? You know, just because she is deaf, blind, and mute doesn't mean that she should be able to get away with this stuff. And we learn that her parents have kind of taken this very lax attitude because of all the disabilities that Helen has, and that they want to treat her like a very special child, and that who can have anything in the world. And Annie, excuse me, Annie makes the point, and it's a very good one. Well, no, if anything, you're turning her into a spoiled brat by letting her have whatever she wants. Because she may not be a normal child, she may have disabilities, but you need to treat her like anyone else, you know, that you would treat anyone else, because how else is she gonna grow up and be able to be as normal a child as she can be anyway? Anyway, I'm explaining this in a very complex way, but I absolutely agree with what Annie was saying there. So eventually she asks the parents and the brother to leave, and she locks the doors on either side of the dining area, and she patiently works with this tantrum throwing Helen to not only get her to sit quietly with her own plate, but also to use a spoon, and they make some progress there, which is wonderful. Annie quickly realizes that when she has time on her own with Helen and without her parents interjecting every so often saying, you can't do that, she's a special child, that she actually gets somewhere. So ultimately, Annie goes for a walk one day and that's the movie that I watched. In the book, she asks Mrs. Keller if there's somewhere that she can go with Annie, where in the film she finds the place on her own, but anyway, if there's somewhere she can go with Annie where they can just be on their own, because she feels if she can have time with Helen just on her own for a significant amount of time, then she'll be able to teach her so much more, discipline being one thing, because Annie's very hung up on, she's so spoiled, really, we need to knock that out of her in the best way that we can, and then teach her. And so she ends up going to this garden house that they have, and it's great. They end up being together for 2 weeks, and she does get Annie to a place where she is much more disciplined. Not really learning so much, even though Annie is teaching her sign language, which I really do appreciate, because I started studying ASL when I was, I'll probably say about 2 years ago. I'm Australian, and in Australia, sign language is called Auslan. But in America, sign language is called ASL. I started studying ASL, despite the fact that I'm Australian, 2 years ago, and I love signing. I've always loved it. And I always thought, hey, if an American came down here and, you know, they needed someone, maybe if I became really good at sign language, I could teach them. And so what Annie ends up doing is really clever. She would grab Helen's hand and start spelling, I know you can't see this, but for example, we've got A, B, C, D, E, so on and so forth. She starts spelling the letters into her hand in a way that Helen can feel it. So she'll be like A, B, C, so she can actually feel it against her hand. Really, really well done. The first thing that she notices that Helen has on her is a doll. So she would have Helen's hand feel the doll, and then she would go D, O, L, L to spell out doll. And I just, oh my god, I fell in love with the book from that moment on. Not to say that the rest wasn't good, but now I was absolutely loving this book. So over time, she gets Helen to be a lot more disciplined and really, just checking the time, okay, we're good, to, you know, be calm and all this stuff. And then over the course of time, she starts putting her hand on other things and spelling out what the things are for her. So for example, she would put Helen's hand in water and then go W-A, T-E-R and spell it for her as well. One day, oh my gosh, I cried at this. Like, I'm not normally a crier with books, but I cried. Anyway, prior to 2020, I only ever cried with, I think it was one scene in Harry Potter. only one. But anyway, but I cried in this moment because Annie keeps making the point to Helen's parents. She knows what the letters are. She knows that I'm spelling things for her, but she's not making the connection that what I'm spelling is the object that I'm getting her to touch first. One day, Helen realizes it. She makes the connection, and Margaret Davidson writes it so well. I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, she writes it in a way that says, suddenly, Helen's eyes grew wide with recognition. She knew that touching, like having her hand being placed under water and then having water spelt for her meant this is water. And then Helen started getting really, really intrigued and getting her teacher, because Annie refers to herself. She spells out the word teacher to refer to herself. So Helen kept getting teacher to point out all these things to her and spell them for her. And oh my gosh, it was just absolutely amazing. Then they moved on to Braille. She started learning Braille. And then one day, Annie had to go off and help Helen's mum with something downstairs. And so Annie decided to surprise Helen. Oh my gosh, we're going to get there one day. Helen decided to surprise Annie, who's downstairs, with Helen's mum, doing something there. I don't know what, but anyway. And she grabs up these Braille flashcards and hides in the cupboard. It just so happens that Annie comes back when Helen goes into the cupboard. So she sees Helen go in there and she goes, "Oh, where's Helen?" And then she opens the door, and to her surprise, on the floor of the cupboard in front of Helen are the words, "Helen is in wardrobe." I think she's in a wardrobe, actually. Helen is in wardrobe. Oh my God, I cried again. Amazing, amazing. So ultimately, and then it kind of got a bit rushed from there on, but basically Helen ended up going to school. She ended up doing really well. Then she wanted to go to Harvard, but she didn't get into Harvard. She got in somewhere else. I don't remember where, but she got in somewhere else, and she ended up graduating cum laude, so like really, really high. And, you know, Annie stayed with her and remained as her teacher. And then in the end, Annie ends up dying, and that's really sad. But Helen went on to continue to do very well, but she wouldn't have done so well if not for Helen Keller would not have gone on to do as well as she did. Well, I would think, if not for Annie Sullivan. The book ends on the line that had me very emotional. The very last sentence of this book is... the last couple of sentences. "So Helen Keller slowly and painfully rebuilt her life into a meaningful pattern. She worked, she laughed, she went on living a full, remarkable life. Annie hadn't failed." Oh my God, just amazing. So, such a great book. Okay, so quickly, I got about 7 minutes. My thoughts on this book. Loved it, loved it, loved it, especially from the halfway mark onwards. It was not to say I didn't like the first half. I did. It was very interesting and very emotional. Maybe not so much interesting, but very emotional, seeing Annie go from this place where she's with family who don't love her. Hello, Harry Potter. A family that don't love her. And then she's taken to Tewkesbury, where life just seems to be even worse than it was. Then her brother ends up dying. Then she finally gets out of Tewkesbury only to go to a blind school where all of the kids tease her because she's older than them. Like, oh my gosh, tugging at the heartstrings for the first half of this book. But once she gets to Helen Keller, my interest peaked because of how much I love sign language and because of how much I appreciated the difficulty of teaching a child who is deaf, blind, and mute and has been treated like a spoiled brat the whole time and never been educated on anything. The fact that she managed to persist all the time, and it wasn't easy. Helen did not make Annie's life easy at all. But the fact that she kept persisting and that she pulled it off in the end, and she had those moments, the first moment where Helen recognizes that what is being spelled on her hand is the object she's touching, and then she's able to form sentences. She even learnt to write because Annie was grabbing a pencil and putting her hand over over Helen's hand and helping her, like, for example, to do an A and a B and things like that. And oh my gosh, what an amazing story. For a biography, it's definitely more of a story, like a storybook biography, but oh my god, so amazing, and it made me want to learn more about Helen Keller. Anyway, and Annie Sullivan as well. So I then went on to the internet to see if I could look at any visuals that might further, aid my reading, I suppose, and like further aid not aid, but enhance is the word I'm after, further enhance my reading. And I came across a film. And I'm so happy that I found it. And when I told my friend who lent me this book in the first place that I watched this film, she said to me, there's a film based on this? So even she didn't know. But there is. It is called The Miracle Worker. And it is, oh my god, it's a visual of the book. And in my next review that I'm going to do for you guys, I'm going to talk about a book who they've created a visual, but it's pretty much nothing like what the book was, but this stuck so firmly to the book. It was amazing. The only thing is the first half of the book is cut out, and we start with Annie Sullivan arriving at Helen Keller's place. We learn little things along the way, like we learned how her brother had disability, we learned how her brother died, and certain other things because she says certain things during the film, the actress that plays Annie Sullivan. But the film was just absolutely amazing to watch. Unfortunately, the film ends so early, and I did not like this, and I was looking for a part 2, or if the version that I had, because I found it on YouTube, if the version I had was cut off early, but no, it wasn't. It ends the moment that Helen Keller makes the connection between the object and what's being spelt on her hands, which is fine, but because of how much I loved this book, I would have gone a heck of a lot further because I wanted to see the wardrobe scene. I wanted to see her go to university and graduate cum laude, or college as you might call it in the US, but we call it university here, and graduate cum laude and do all these amazing things because she ended up doing so many good things, Helen Keller. I wanted to see all that stuff as well. So unfortunately we didn't get to see that. All in all, this is an amazing read. It's an amazingly quick read as well. The only reason it took me so long to get through it, because I started reading this, I think, at the beginning of the month, and I only just finished it like 3 weeks into the month, so it took me a long time, is because, as I said, I wasn't so motivated to keep going back to the book. But I'm so glad that I persisted. I'm so glad I got through it. This is definitely a book I recommend to you if you want to learn more about, well, Helen Keller's teacher, Annie Sullivan, but also if you want to learn more about how Helen Keller became the person she became. And in my opinion, this would not have happened without the persistence and dedication of Annie Sullivan. Amazing book, a short read, easy to read writing style. I absolutely recommend it. And that is why this book receives 4 stars from me. So you can check out my Goodreads over there if you would like. Thank you so much for watching. If you have read that book or if you are interested in getting that book, please do leave me a comment in the space below and let's discuss it together. Alright guys, I will see you again very soon. So letting you guys go, peace, blessings, and so much love. And I'll speak to you again soon. Mwah. My next review comes out tomorrow, so check out that one. Coming up then. Bye guys, happy reading!